Good evening, everyone. My name is Jason Rabinovitz. I am the Chief Operating Officer and General Counsel for Score at the Top Learning Centers and Schools and JRA Educational Consulting. I am really excited tonight to hand over the webinar responsibilities to our friends. So let me introduce first Dr. Erica Cerrato. She's a licensed psychologist and former teacher who has worked extensively with children and adolescents since 2008. She received her bachelor's degree in psychology at the University of Notre Dame and her master's degree in education at ASU. She then obtained her master's and doctoral degrees in clinical psychology at FSU. Dr. Cerrato completed a residency at the University of Texas Dell's Children Medical Center and her postdoctoral fellowship at FIU's Center for the Children and Families. Dr. Cerrato has developed expertise, published research, and provided evaluations and treatment in the domains of neurodevelopmental conditions and social, emotional, and behavioral challenges. She works out of PPA's Aventura and Boca locations. And I also have with me Dr. Bridget Davidson. Dr. Davidson is a licensed psychologist specializing in providing comprehensive evaluations and evidence based therapy services in English and Spanish. She has specialized expertise in neurodiversity across the lifespan, including extensive experience working with individuals on the autism spectrum and their families. She specializes in working with children with ADHD, learning differences, behavior concerns, trauma, and anxiety. Dr. Davidson received her bachelor's degree in clinical psychology and studio art at the University of Miami. She then earned her master's and doctoral degrees in clinical psychology at the University of Texas at Austin. She completed a residency and postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Miami Mellman Center for Child Development. Dr. Davidson was an assistant professor in pediatrics at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine before joining Pediatric Psychology Associates in 2020. She works at the PPA's Aventura, Boca, and Weston locations. Thank you both for coming tonight.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for having us.
You're welcome. All right, so I am going to turn it over to Dr. Cerrato to start our presentation off.
Yes. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. We are going to cover 5 different objectives. One, talking about neurodevelopmental differences. Dr. Davidson will be talking about red flags and specific diagnoses, as well as the long-term consequences of unaddressed academic and neurodevelopmental struggles. And then I'll pick it up talking more about comprehensive evaluations, what they entail, the learning profiles that we can generate from those evaluations, as well as what are our evaluation outcomes after the fact. So how can we help support accommodations, interventions, parent strategies, etc. And then finally, we'll have some time for discussion and Q&A. So I'm going to hand it over now to Dr. Davidson to talk us through neurodevelopmental differences.
Thanks, Dr. Cerrato. So some of the things that we look for when we're trying to understand a student's profile, and I will say that we work with all different ages across the lifespan. So we're focusing right now mostly on school-age children, but we do start to look at these things as early as toddlerhood. And sometimes are identifying them for the first time in late adolescence, sometimes even into adulthood. But across the lifespan, we're looking at neurodevelopmental differences that can affect learning, behavior, communication, different aspects of an individual's functioning. And sometimes these fall under different categories, such as ADHD, the autism spectrum, learning differences, and speech and language or communication disorders. So we'll go into a little detail about each of these, but it is important to acknowledge that traits, behaviors, and symptoms all exist on a continuum. So you hear about the autism spectrum, but the truth is a lot of these things that we're talking about exist along some type of continuum, whether it's a child's cognitive abilities or their language skills, even social behaviors can exist along a continuum. So we're really talking about neurodiversity and differences. And some of our individuals may have skills along one end or the other, but often we see a mix depending on which area of functioning we're looking at. So we'll go into a little more detail now about different traits and behaviors that we examine. So one of them being attention and self-regulation. So we know, if we think about learning, that these are critical skills. And I do call them skills because they are things that we can learn, that can be taught. But naturally, some of this comes easier to some of us than others. So even just attention, there are so many different aspects and types of attention. So one would be focused attention. So being able to direct your attention to the appropriate stimuli. So for example, looking at these slides, looking at the computer screen rather than what's outside the window or what's in the background in the vicinity, that's focused attention. In a classroom, it could be paying attention to what the teacher's saying rather than the student next to you, for example. Sustained attention is being able, not just for a couple of minutes, but usually in a classroom for an extended period of time to maintain that focus. Selective attention, again, is filtering out distractions. So not just where do I direct my attention, which thing am I focusing on right now, but how do I tune out all of the other things that are vying for my attention. Flexibility and shifting our attention is a big one that we look at as well. So we think about this when we think of a child who may have difficulty with transitions between activities or tasks. So, they may focus in on one thing, but then it's hard to shift. And you see this at home as well. So maybe we're very focused on a video game, but then it's very hard to transition to homework time or bath time or bedtime. And that has to do with that flexibility. Cognitive inhibition is the ability to pause and to stop and think before acting, which, is something that children really have to work on. And again, comes more naturally to some of us. If you think about this goes hand in hand with impulsivity as well. So a child who has more difficulty with inhibiting their thoughts or their behaviors is more likely to act impulsively. And when it comes to thoughts, this could be, instead of following a train of thought that may distract me, again, thinking about the task at hand. And again, behavioral inhibition is more of what you see on the outside. So pausing before acting. So all of these things play a very important role in a child's behavior and a student's learning. So it's really important to understand which aspects may be a strength or a challenge for someone. So some red flags for ADHD may be more difficulty remaining focused despite trying. Avoiding tasks that require sustained mental effort. So sometimes this can actually look like defiance or being oppositional. But when we dig a little deeper and do some structured testing, we realize that it's actually difficult for that person, even if they are trying, for them to sustain that mental effort. And they may need something like more breaks, more frequent breaks. Sometimes we see children who are very bright or are capable of handling the task, but they make very careless mistakes. They're not checking their work. They might rush through. In something like mathematics, they might mistake the sign of operation. So they're doing subtraction when it should be addition. And they may know how to do the task, but they're getting things marked wrong because of those careless errors. A big one is difficulty with organization. And this is part of executive functioning, but it's that, difficulty knowing what to prioritize in terms of studies, how to break things down into smaller steps. Forgetfulness is a big one. So we see students who may get the work done, but forget to hand it in on time, or they forget what even assignments they're supposed to be doing. Difficulty sitting still or having that high energy, high need for input, sensory input and movement is a big one. And then also impulsive behavior. So the kids who are interrupting, again, that could be perceived as a misbehavior, but it may be something that's difficult for them to control. Sometimes we see that interrupting is really related to poor working memory. So the child is interrupting because they are afraid that if they don't say it right then and there, they're going to forget exactly what that thought was if they wait their turn. So that's another big one. And then, of course, whenever there are any concerns about any risky behaviors, this is a huge red flag that we need to be looking into this. can keep going to the next one. So another aspect that we commonly address are differences in social communication. And so when people think of communication, they're usually thinking about what a child is able to say or understand, but there's really far more to it. So we look at nonverbal communication, things like how people use eye contact to maintain interactions or use gestures to express themselves, their tone of voice, their facial expressions, those types of things to communicate, and also their understanding of nonverbal communication. So some people may have a hard time reading, from someone's face. Maybe they're saying one thing, but their face says another with sarcasm or something like that. And that can be sometimes hard for people to understand. We do look at language, and we look at how children are using the language they have, both receptively, their understanding, and also how they express themselves. We look at social reciprocity. So this is the back and forth of conversations, not just one-sided talking our ear off, going on and on and on, but really having that sense of give and take in the interaction. Also being able to shift to different topics of conversation, not just ones that are related to someone's intense interest, for example. We look at emotional reciprocity. So understanding, being able to take someone else's perspective and understand what they may be feeling and how to respond to that. So many times someone may be able to identify, oh, that person looks sad, but they're not quite sure how to respond to that appropriately. Another thing that goes hand in hand with that is social awareness. So being able to read the room is a big one that we hear from parents, like he just struggles to read the room, using humor when it's not appropriate, things like that. Adjusting to also who they're speaking with, right? So knowing this is how I speak with a teacher or my parent versus another peer, for example. And then we also look at the quality of relationships. So how are kids initiating friendships, maintaining them, repairing them if something goes wrong, those types of things. And this is really all related to how someone's social functioning is going. And again, it's important to understand if there are strengths in any of these areas, but if there are difficulties in these areas, we can really target how to help that person. So a lot of what I just spoke about in terms of social communication, those are red flags for something like the autism spectrum. And it doesn't mean that having just one of those things necessarily means the person has autism. It's really how things cluster and come together. So understanding the full picture. So some red flags when people are younger may be early language or communication delays, not always. Sometimes we also have kids who are the opposite. So they may be hyperlexic. They may have very advanced vocabularies. But again, it's outside the norm. And if we think of that continuum that we illustrated, again, it's like this end where they're struggling with communication. They're having language delays. They might not be speaking as expected. Or on the flip side, they may speak like a little professor or have very advanced vocabulary that is surprising and unexpected for their age. Sometimes we see differences even in the quality of someone's communication. So they may sound very flat, very monotone, or they might be very sing-song in how they speak. Sometimes they may have a very low pitch, very high pitch. It's just a different vocal quality. I did explain a bit about the nonverbal communication and how that could be different. So avoiding eye contact or having a preference for not making eye contact. Also, difficulties with personal space. So this is a common one where kids can be really perceived the wrong way, but they just don't really comprehend. They're not aware of their body and space, or perhaps even the social expectations around that. And also we look at how people interact. So are they withdrawn? Do they prefer to be alone or have difficulty joining groups rather than having more joint interactions? And again, everything is along a continuum. So if it's just a preference sometimes, that's one thing. But if it's something that's getting in their way, that's where we start to really want to have a better understanding. Sometimes we see an insistence on sameness. So that could be preferring to wear the same types of clothing, preferring to stick to the routine, having difficulty if something doesn't go as expected in the routine, preferring the same foods. So really, I think of this as having a very tight comfort zone. And sometimes it can actually involve anxiety if we're veering outside that comfort zone too. And then sensory differences are a really big one to look at. And we see sensory differences in individuals with ADHD sometimes as well, or other conditions, not just autism. But this can look like sensory seeking behaviors. So lots of fidgeting, putting things in the mouth, a need for a lot of input. Or it can also look like jumping, bouncing, a lot of input that way. Or sometimes we see aversions, so really not liking being hugged or touched. Really being sensitive to things like clothing, tags on clothing, types of fabrics, not wanting to get dirty or messy, or a lot of times I hear about kids who don't like the beach because of the sand, things like that. Noises are another big one. So sometimes we see people who avoid crowded, busy environments, and we realize it's not actually necessarily all of the people, but the noise, depending on the person and the situation. So again, something like that, avoiding certain places, we're trying to figure out what are the aspects that are getting in the way there. And sometimes sensory differences are overlooked or misunderstood. And then there are other neurodivergent behaviors that we sometimes see. So again, these are not always indicative of autism, but things like different body movements. So sometimes we see particular hand posturing, hand flapping when excited or upset, some tensing, things like that. Sometimes these are present early on and they kind of fade out as individuals get older. Or sometimes people also control them depending on the environment they're in. So they might not do this at school, but at home, when they're in the comfort of their home or their room, you might see some of these behaviors more so. So another big thing that we assess are learning differences. And again, we're looking at when does it really meet the threshold and cross over into a learning disability? When is it more than just a difference, right? So some of us have strengths and weaknesses, but they're all in the range of what is expected or what is normative for many people. But then there are those of us who may struggle much more in one area or more than one area. And so it's very important to understand this for children as soon as possible. And this is really important for parents and also as they get older, especially for the person themselves to understand that this is separate from one's intelligence. So we also sometimes work with children who may be gifted intellectually, so very, very bright, but they may still have a learning disability. And you hear of this as 2E, which means twice exceptional. And that would be where you are gifted on one hand, but then at the same time, again, you may have a learning disability in something like math or reading. So those things can exist at the same time, which sometimes surprises parents. And it's really important to understand, again, that someone's learning profile and whether they have a learning disability is really separate from their intelligence. So it does not mean that a person is not quote unquote smart or that they're not bright. And sometimes parents come to us and say, is he just lazy? Does she just not care about school? Is she just not motivated? Or is this actually hard for her? It's hard for us to tell. And so having an assessment can really help to tease this apart. So what we do when we look at learning differences and whether it's a learning disorder is not just look at what are their grades, what is their academic performance, but also we do testing to look at what underlies those skills. So not just looking at their reading score, but looking at lots of things that underlie reading so that we can better understand their profile. But there are three main types of learning disorders. So one would be with impairment in reading. The second would be in mathematics, and the third would be in written expression. So this is just a simplified way to look at the three, but A parent may know my child is very behind in reading, and a teacher may know that the child is performing poorly in reading. But until we do testing, it's often difficult to know which type of reading disability the child has. So, for example, if a child has dyslexia, they may have what you classically think of as a reading disability, where it's hard for them to make out the words on the page, to read them correctly aloud. Um, they may read much more slowly. And then, of course, because of that, they have trouble with comprehending what they've read. But I also want to point out that many times we see children who are able to read aloud accurately. So they're saying the words, it all sounds right. They may even go at an appropriate rate, so they're not reading slowly. So you can hear them and they sound perfectly fine. But then when we go to ask questions about what they've just read, it becomes clear that they're really having trouble with the comprehension. And so that is a profile that I think is sometimes misunderstood, especially if a parent or someone else hears them reading. And again, it sounds good at face value, but then there may be a language-based learning disability where they're having trouble comprehending again. And so it's important to understand which profile a person has so that we can then tailor our strategies for intervening and for teaching them. With math, there are also different types. So someone may do okay with calculation and number sense, but then when it comes to word problems, again, there's language involved there, and that could be what trips them up. Some children or students may need much more concrete math with things that are tactile, right? They need to see blocks, they need to do it that way. They're working on understanding how to visualize and have that number sense. So things like dates, time, things like that may also be difficult for someone who has that type of a mathematics disorder. And then in writing, there's so much that goes into writing, but this includes things like spelling. It also includes understanding the rules of grammar, punctuation, or even the clarity and organization of someone's writing. So maybe if they are speaking, they're able to organize their thoughts and ideas, but then when they go to put things on paper, it's very challenging. So it might be disorganized or simplified compared to what they're able to verbalize if we were to ask them orally to explain something. And then also something we look at is handwriting. And when a child is younger, we might do things like occupational therapy to help with handwriting. As they get older, we often work on things like dictation or typing or workarounds if necessary. But it's important to understand what's difficult about handwriting for someone as well. And this is key because we don't want someone to just be simplifying their responses just because the handwriting is a burden, for example. So it's very difficult when we see kids who are very bright and they can give you their responses out loud and they're elaborate, they're detailed, they've got great ideas. And then when they go to put them on paper, it's very simplified and not up to par with their true knowledge. And so it's important, again, for us to understand this. So we do look at whether students are performing below grade level or not meeting expectations. And we also look at not just what are the scores, but how are they responding to learning? Are they avoidant? Are they frustrated? Are they aware and do they have insight that it's a struggle for them? So those are important factors as well in terms of how to best help them. So I mentioned a little bit about communication and social communication before, but I wanted to speak a little more specifically about different speech and language disorders. So we do see individuals who have differences in their expressive language. So this, again, has to do with vocabulary, how they're able to explain their experiences or describe what's happened to them. So sometimes we see people who have a decent vocabulary for labeling things um, or requesting things, for example, but then they have difficulty kind of sequencing events, right? So if they were to tell a story or to retell what they've read, it's difficult for them. Receptive language is their understanding of what they hear or what they've read also. And so it's difficulty understanding the meaning. Sometimes the literal meaning, sometimes the deeper meaning. So as students get older, and subjects become more complex, they may struggle to understand sarcasm or sort of the reading between the lines, as well, or following instructions. Again, this could be misperceived as a child who is just not obeying, not listening. And sometimes when we do further testing, we come to realize that they actually do struggle with comprehending instructions at a certain level. And so that's a key difference. Sometimes we see students who have speech disorders. And so this is where they're struggling to articulate clearly. And there are milder versions of this, and depending on what's developmentally appropriate. So as language develops, it's very common to struggle with certain sounds, but then we have milestones where at some point those start to self-correct usually. And so when we see something like an R sound or an S sound, which we commonly have heard of as a lisp, when some of those things are persisting past a certain age, that's when we really start to become more concerned, because I want to explain that this not only affects how a person is understood and can express themselves, but also it can become a social challenge as well, which can then become an emotional challenge. And so the other thing is that parents sometimes think, I guess this is just how she speaks, like there's nothing we can do about it. But the truth is, even at older ages, speech therapy can be very helpful. Some parents feel like, oh, we lost the window. He's too old now to correct that. But it is important for us to understand articulation challenges. And then there's fluency, so stuttering, which again, sometimes is very mild and just occurs when a child is excited or stressed. Sometimes it is more moderate or severe, where it really does start to interfere with their functioning. And then pragmatic communication, I think this is a big one that people don't always think about as much. But again, this goes back to the social aspects of language, that reciprocity and turn taking, the nonverbals, all of those things in social communication that I described before, which are commonly, so I would say those are more common difficulties in individuals with autism, but sometimes we see them outside of autism as well. So this is quite a long list. These are different conditions that we assess, and I feel, there are more here that are not listed. But I think it's important for parents to understand that when they take their child to a psychologist or a neuropsychologist for an evaluation, you may come to us and you may say, does my child have ADHD? Or do they have dyslexia or a learning disability or autism? So many times parents may be worried about one thing, or anxiety or an emotional concern. Or they don't have a label that they're thinking of, but they're just really focused on, he's having so many tantrums, we can't manage his behavior. Or she's really struggling with anxiety, but we don't really understand why. So even though there may be a very clear presenting concern or question that teachers or parents may have, when we do a comprehensive evaluation, we are not just looking at one thing. We are also looking at the full picture. So Dr. Cerrato will explain the different domains that we assess, but we don't just say, okay, this is an evaluation to rule in or out, to rule autism in or out, or ADHD in or out. We are looking at these potential concerns as well. And sometimes that is frightening. We didn't mention this, but we're both parents as well. So I have 3 young children. I know it can be scary sometimes to look at these labels, and I have a child who has more than one of these labels. So sometimes it can be anxiety provoking for the parent to think about this part of it, but it really is important for us and as parents and for those working with our children to understand a child in this way. And this really is just a tool to help them really to make our strategies and our plan and our approach more effective for that person. But the whole point is we don't just come in only looking at one thing, we're really looking at the full picture. So just briefly, I wanted to touch on the consequences or potential consequences of not further evaluating these things. So um, I think that one of the things that happens is sometimes we realize a child is struggling. We sort of wait to see, are they going to catch up, or will this thing help or that thing help? And let's give it some more time before we really go for a full assessment. Um, but in thinking about the possible impacts of not addressing these struggles, especially when it comes to academic success in particular, um, earlier is better. So the earlier we understand and the earlier we can intervene and help someone. And there are different levels of that, right? So that could be certain accommodations or supports at school, or sometimes a more intensive approach. But the earlier we can start that, the more a child is going to benefit. So without that support, you might see a widening of those gaps in their skills. And then it becomes harder for that person to catch up or to stay on track. Um, you might also see some behavioral patterns or emotional patterns as well, where you're starting to see more frustration, more avoidance of difficult tasks. Students can start to feel, we talk about a growth mindset, and students can really start to get a fixed mindset where they feel like they're just stuck. They're never going to be good at math. There's nothing they can do about it, for example. And so they just totally want to avoid it. And so the longer this goes on, the more fixed that becomes and the harder it is to sort of break those thought patterns as well. As students transition in particular to middle school, there are a lot more academic challenges, demands, and expectations. The truth is that a child their skills may be progressing, they're on their own curve, but as they're progressing, the demands are also continuing to increase year over year. And so sometimes we see that they are able to scrape by early on in their schooling, but then as those demands really become higher later on, that's when parents and teachers start to realize how significant their learning challenges might be, or some of their other challenges. So social challenges are a big one as well that we start to see later on. So in terms of the social and emotional piece, as you can imagine, it's sort of a snowball effect where, someone who struggles academically might then see themselves as less capable, not as smart. They might feel jealous of their siblings or their peers, even if they're not verbalizing any of this. A lot of times people are much more self-aware than we realize, or that they let on or are able to communicate. And so that can really impact someone's sense of belonging as well. It can, of course, lower their self-esteem. And then unfortunately, this is a negative cycle where then they become less motivated to try, more frustrated, more overwhelmed, more anxious. I just spoke with a family this morning about a child who has pretty significant learning disabilities and autism. He's in trying so hard to be in a mainstream setting with a general curriculum, and he's in 8th grade, and finally it's at the point where we realize like it's just not worth his mental health to continue on that path. And so at some point, especially as parents, we have to look at the full picture, not just those test scores are very important sometimes, but the full picture of someone's well-being. And unfortunately, the impacts of struggling with things like academics, for the reasons that I outlined, can really start to influence someone's emotional well-being too. I spoke a little bit about how people can be misunderstood as well. So seeming lazy, or that they're not trying or not cooperating when really it's just a challenge for them. And sometimes we also see acting out behaviors. So goofing off in class, being, just off task or not trying at all, refusing to do the work, those types of things, which are really masking the fact that it's actually difficult for them to do the task. So this is sort of, can be discouraging, but I think next what we want to talk about is how comprehensive evaluations can help to really reduce the risk of these things happening. So I'll pass it over to Dr. Cerrato, who's going to talk through the process, and then we'll have some time at the end for some questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Davidson. I will jump into our comprehensive evaluations and how we use them, essentially. So I hope that this will be helpful to understand the process. Maybe you all have been through the process. Maybe might seek a reevaluation in the future at some point, but hopefully this information will be helpful, and how we approach it at PPA is very comprehensive, as you see in the title. So I'll talk more about that. So at PPA, across ages, evaluations, of course, are with a highly qualified psychologist, but I want to point out what's in bold down below. The team consultation approach is a big one and a unique one at our practice. We have several evaluators and we all work collaboratively. So we're often getting input from each other and having two psychologists' eyes on an evaluation, or discussing that with our senior psychologists or senior neuropsychologists. So it's a really nice team approach. We have quick scheduling and turnaround, multiple sessions of testing, as well as a review of records, a caregiver interview, the direct testing sessions, observations, consultations, having parents and teachers fill out rating scales, of course. And if you've been through this process, I'm sure it sounds familiar. So it's a very comprehensive and holistic approach to gathering as much information as we can about each child. School observations we also do. So that's another unique part of our evaluations. Particularly before we meet the child, we might sneak in and sit in the classroom to be able to observe them in that setting. After the evaluation, of course, we provide a feedback session. Some parents have told me that they've never gotten a feedback session, even though their child has previously been diagnosed with a neurodevelopmental disorder. They just saw it on a paper, for example. We don't want that to happen. Of course, we want to talk through the results first before giving the thorough written report, so that you can both hear it, talk about your thoughts and feelings, and then receive that written report to be able to digest it on your own time. We also provide follow-up consultation if needed. So consultations with caregivers after the fact, possibly with the student or child themselves, to be able to share this information with them if it's developmentally appropriate, and or school meetings or consultations with OTs, SLPs, etc. Okay, we have quite a few domains that are assessed, so let me go through those briefly. Cognitive functioning encompasses a wide variety of skills and abilities. So we're talking intellectual functioning, reasoning, information processing, problem solving, and memory. And all of those different domains are tested separately in many evaluations, and so that we can really hone in on what the levels of cognitive functioning are in different domains. Academic and pre-academic skills, depending on the age. So, of course, we look at their academic functioning across reading, writing, math, and as Dr. Davidson alluded to before, the different components of those skills within those domains. Executive functioning is a big one. I'm glad to hear about this becoming more and more known in our culture and in our discussions as parents and as educators and professionals. So executive functioning encompasses things like attention, working memory. That's the ability to hold things in mind for very short durations. Inhibitory control, like impulse control, cognitive flexibility, that shifting that Dr. Davidson talked about, as well as planning and organizing. This is the domain in which I conducted research and have published and really have dived into these different executive functioning skills and abilities, so that we can really understand what's underlying the difficulties that we see on the surface. Language, we assess receptive and expressive language, as Dr. Davidson talked about, and communication, which she also talked about as being separate from and in addition to language. Visual motor skills, the handwriting skills that Dr. Davidson mentioned, sensory processing, which we discussed, adaptive functioning, which is your child's independence, their self-help skills, their daily living skills, their chores, their ability to manage things like food or money at a certain age, those kinds of functional skills. And then, of course, we look at social, emotional, and behavioral functioning. We do that through both direct testing, questionnaires, and interviews with the child or the adolescent or the adult, as well as parent and teacher reports of social, emotional, and behavioral functioning. I want to note what you see at the bottom, which is that, of course, these are all adapted by age and developmental level and how we choose the test battery. And then results are normed. So we're able to compare those to same aged or similar aged children, adolescents, adults. Our most common comprehensive evaluations that we conduct are a comprehensive developmental eval or psychodevelopmental eval. So we're thinking maybe preschool age range. Dr. Davidson actually does even the younger kiddos, so like toddlers, even some in infancy, if there are some early developmental concerns. But I think that this crowd that you guys, your kiddos are probably in an older age range. But these psychodevelopmental evals are common in the preschool age. Comprehensive psychoeducational evaluations are the ones that maybe you are most familiar with and that most people are most familiar with in academics, et cetera. And those can be from kindergarten through adulthood. And this is more academic, adaptive, communication, attention, executive functioning, social, behavioral. Those are all part of our psychoeducational evaluations. So those might be the presenting concerns. And then neuropsychological evaluations might be related to more complex social communication differences that maybe coincide with psychiatric or emotional difficulties. And so we have senior neuropsychologists on our staff that conduct those evaluations as well. And we all discuss that comprehensive battery. So we assess all of these domains of functioning. There are some other reasons for evaluations, and for those of you who have already had an initial psychoeducational evaluation or other eval conducted for your child, there may be some other reasons for that. Maybe there's a change in their functioning, perhaps a decline in academic functioning in a particular domain, or maybe just minimal change in response to intervention. So you're seeing that they're receiving the intervention, you're ensuring that that's happening, they're getting tutoring, or they're getting speech and language therapy, or they're getting occupational therapy, or behavioral therapy, or these interventions that are recommended, but you're seeing minimal change in response to those. So maybe it's time to see if there is something else going on or something additional that has come up in their functioning as demands have increased with age. Reevaluations are common to assess progress, for example, response to interventions, as well as to update recommendations or an educational plan, an IEP, address new or previously unaddressed concerns. And then life events. So transition periods like entering kindergarten is a big one. Entering middle school is another big one. And then high school and then college. And with each of these transitions, there is an increase in demands for independent functioning. There's an increase in demands for executive functioning. There's an increase in demands for attention, social interaction, social skills, social communication. So those big life changes can often come along with challenges that have emerged or maybe been exacerbated by the increased demands. Life stressors and trauma can certainly contribute to neuropsychological changes or different presentations of behavioral or cognitive differences that were not there before. And then maybe a new school or to find school placement recommendations if the current school is not quite suiting the needs of your child. And for any of you who are at, for example, like SCORE Academy, you know that process, right? That your child may have not been thriving in a traditional educational environment. So you're looking for somewhere different. Our evaluation goals, there are many, but I'm going to highlight 3 of them. So first is, as Dr. Davidson alluded to, is to identify the processes, skills, and abilities that underlie the difficulties that we observe or that you observe as a parent or that educators observe. For example, what does underlie an individual's reading challenges? Is it phonological difficulties, the ability to identify pieces of language and identify sounds and symbols and their association, identify how to organize sounds, et cetera, et cetera? Is it a language disorder that affects multiple aspects of language processing? So maybe there's a reading comprehension difficulty, but it's more about language processing more generally and piecing together parts of language into a whole. Is it a lack of fluency or automaticity in reading? And if so, that places extremely high demands on the working memory system. So if we have individual sounds that we're trying to blend together into a word, or individual words that we're trying to blend together into a sentence, or individual sentences that we're blending together into a paragraph. If we don't have automaticity in reading and understanding as we go, that places very high demands on the working memory system, which is very limited in capacity. So that can also contribute to reading challenges. And we'll be able to see that. Is working memory capacity typical for your child, or is it less, is it less capacity than we would expect for their age? I already mentioned maybe the reading difficulty is about combining verbal information into a cohesive whole. Is it about verbal memory that's a specific challenge versus visual memory? So all of these things are things we can evaluate in a comprehensive eval. We want to understand each child's unique pattern of strengths and support needs. All of us have this unique pattern. Every human has their specific unique pattern that emerges from their biological, genetic, nervous system functioning, environmental input, all of these things that create these very unique brains that we all have and these unique patterns of strengths and support needs. And then finally, we want to identify how we can modify the environment. So maybe make accommodations and promote skill building, both modifying the environment around the child and helping to build their skills to help each child thrive in whatever way thriving looks for them. Thriving does not have to look the same from one child to the next, or one adolescent to the next, or one adult to the next. So we want to really individualize this process so that you feel supported, your child or adolescent feels supported, and that we understand that we're trying to meet them where they are, as well as helping them grow and change. I wanted to quickly address some evaluation myths. So they're too young. We should wait to do an evaluation. As I mentioned, Dr. Davidson works with even little toddlers, sometimes, very young. Maybe they're not even walking yet, right? So we can do those evaluations early as soon as some of those red flags are a concern. They'll probably catch up on their own. They'll grow out of it, or the pediatrician didn't seem concerned, so it's okay. Or my relative didn't talk until they were 4 years old, so let's just give it time. This is actually true for one of my family members, right? Let's just give it time. It's fine, They were 4, so, my kid's 3. They're not talking yet. It's okay. Let's just give it time. These are all related to this whole idea that they'll progress on their own, which they will. However, that gap will continue to widen between the demands and their abilities. So research suggests that gap widens over time. It doesn't close typically over time without extensive interventions. The school will not accept this evaluation. That is not true. Actually, we can provide an even more comprehensive evaluation than schools can, and it often helps them expedite this evaluation process, or getting an IEP or a 504 plan. The diagnosis from the psychiatrist, neurologist, or pediatrician is all we need. Not true. Many insurances will come back and say, hey, we can't cover services unless you go get an additional component of testing. So for example, the ADOS for autism. We're not going to cover services unless we have that. So then you might have already gotten a diagnosis, but now you need to go to another practitioner, primarily a psychologist, to do that additional part of the evaluation. They were evaluated when they were younger, so we don't need another. We kind of already addressed that with changing needs, changing demands, new transitions in life. Evaluations never expire. The truth is that many schools require a new evaluation, let's say every 3 years, or there may be a need to add new recommendations to their IEP, that kind of thing. We all change and evolve, so our needs do too. The report or diagnosis goes on the child's record and must be shared. That is not true. This is your report and your child's diagnosis, to do with it what you choose to do with that. And we can help guide you in what might be most helpful, but this is not something that needs to be shared, and it's also protected health information. So one school, for example, cannot share it with another school without your express consent. Okay, so let's talk about what these evaluations actually lead to, right? So why do these very comprehensive evaluations? Well, it's primarily so that we can inform the next steps. So we're going to talk about those next steps here. So these are some of the outcomes that are important to us when we do evaluations. First is understanding the learning or developmental profile. We've talked about that profile a little bit. So really learning what those individual strengths and support needs are. It also is helpful to establish a baseline with the first eval and then be able to measure progress from that baseline. We can provide diagnoses if applicable, documentation, as mentioned, for insurance, and also program eligibility or scholarship eligibility. We really want to create a person-centered treatment plan and a link to specific referrals for that person. So we've worked very hard to identify referrals in the community, like Score at the Top, so that we know what might fit best for each individual. We also offer continuing consultation with parents and other professionals to help navigate services or seamlessly kind of blend services so that we're all working as part of the same team, being kind of the quarterback to help put those plays into action all together. Evaluations also can help inform educational placement, school placement, the 504 plan or IEP, school supports, interventions, and of course, accommodations. So, accommodations also can occur for things like the SAT, other entrance exams, higher education in college or universities, and so forth. So, on the note of accommodations, I want to kind of talk a little bit more about that. In school, of course, these evals can help to initiate plans. A lot of those plans include accommodations. Sometimes they're very general. Ours are very tailored. We really want to make sure that if we're recommending a certain accommodation, there's a rationale behind that and a reason why that accommodation we think will be helpful for your child. We can help support individualized approaches in schools like Score Academy or the tutoring that you might receive at Score at the Top, help inform that tutoring approach or inform the executive functioning coaching, which we have heard from Score at the Top has become more and more popular lately, right? Let's tailor the executive functioning coaching to what areas of executive functioning might be a challenge. Okay, so on the topic of accommodations, how can we modify the environment to help our children access learning, physical activities, social interactions, etc.? For some physical disabilities, an accommodation or a support might look like this, maybe prosthetics or wheelchair for mobility purposes. These are tools to help someone access the world in a way that they might not otherwise be able to access it. In our domain, I think that people have a harder time seeing accommodations in this way, but I want to think about them very much the same, that we are providing prosthetic sort of scaffolds to help support someone reach a goal that maybe they couldn't previously without those accommodations or support. A sort of cognitive or learning or developmental disability is very similar to a physical disability in some ways, right? It's sort of a type of condition that has some challenges in someone's access to the world or their engagement in sort of our neurotypical world. And so it can be similar in the sense that it's not something that someone is choosing. They're not like lazy, as Dr. Davidson mentioned. They're not trying hard enough. But it's harder to see that because neurodivergence or developmental learning, attention difficulties, those are not visible to the naked eye. So we might not think about accommodations and supports in this same way. But I hope that you will after we discuss them more thoroughly and after kind of you go on with your life and think about accommodations in the future. I really want you to kind of picture what that can look like. So some sample accommodations by domain. This would be discovered through a comprehensive evaluation is what are the domains that accommodations might be helpful in supporting this child or this adolescent. So if they have a sustained attention difficulty, maybe we recommend front-loading instructions, breaks for movement or brain breaks, praising on-task behavior, but then helping to support the child get back on task. For working memory, we recommend visual supports to take some of that information out of the working memory system and put it on paper or on a Post-it note. Have a student repeat directions, or your child repeat directions back to you, so that you know it got into their working memory system and they're able to reiterate that so that they can recall it more easily. A smart pen is a great accommodation for some. Maybe if you're a high school or a college student, the smart pen records the audio from a lecture and links it up with the notes that the student is taking, which is awesome. Shifting or cognitive flexibility difficulties, we might recommend very clear instructions, one task at a time, offering transition warnings. For planning and organization, we may suggest checklists or breaking down tasks and chunking work in an organized way for the individual. Consistent routines can be very helpful to offload some of the executive functioning demands in planning and organization, etc. For processing speed difficulties, often, of course, we recommend extended time, and we look at, how much extended time might be helpful based on how they did on tasks and testing and how much extra time they may have needed. And if we provide that, we can determine how much extra time is most effective. Visual, spatial, or fine motor skills. So maybe we recommend typing or text-to-speech or graph paper. Auditory processing, we suggest that teachers provide a copy of the class notes so that it's in front of them instead of just auditory. Preferential seating to be able to hear and focus on auditory input from the teacher. For language, we might suggest simplified instructions or a visual and verbal presentation of information, software to organize ideas visually. And sensory stimulation and regulation needs, which we often see in neurodevelopmental conditions. So maybe we recommend using mints or gum to have a little bit of an increase in stimulation. Noise canceling headphones to decrease the auditory stimulation. Dimming overhead lights, ambient music without lyrics sometimes can elevate a little bit of the nervous system functioning. Standing or moving or fidgeting or using an exercise band or a wiggle cushion. These are things that we might recommend depending on the results of the evaluation. And we can also look at these by diagnosis. So a reading SLD, maybe auditory or audio recordings while reading, or having a designated reader at school or for tests. Writing SLD, again, depending on the profile, maybe typing or dictating their answers, using digital spell check if spelling is getting in the way of their written communication. Mind maps or planning sheets if writing organization is an issue. Rubrics, a writing mechanics checklist, again, to offload some of those working memory demands, etc. A math SLD, maybe, again, depending on the profile, written steps for problem solving so a child can see those steps. Prompt correction of errors so they're not practicing the wrong skill or the wrong procedure over and over again. Use of manipulatives, a calculator, a math fact sheet. Those are all helpful depending on what's underlying the math SLD. For ADHD, we already talked about a lot of these, but checklists, rubrics, breaking down projects, movement breaks, fidgeting, all of those things. Also, I want to highlight that a positive reinforcement plan can be added to an IEP or 504 or education plan, and that can be really useful in reducing some of the critical feedback that kids with ADHD often get. Sit still, stop talking, pay attention. Instead, let's create a positive reinforcement plan for when they are doing those things effectively. Reduce critical feedback and redirection. And instead, we recommend often to ignore minor disruptions and then praise on-task behavior as soon as possible. For autism spectrum, often a visual schedule is helpful so kiddos know what's coming up. Having consistent routines that increase a feeling of comfort and familiarity, using visual timers, having transition warnings, permitting stimming or those kind of motor movements that Dr. Davidson described when they're not disruptive. Those stimming behaviors often help self-regulate. Supportive social coaching when needed, or having an aide or a shadow. These are all things that may be recommended after a diagnostic evaluation. So I want to share briefly a case example about a kiddo in upper elementary at a rigorous private school. I just completed this evaluation. He has been very advanced throughout early elementary. But this year, having some organizational challenges in math and writing specifically, and teachers are starting to report executive functioning challenges to parents. The evaluation results suggested that he was incredibly intellectually gifted, very, very advanced, very gifted intellectually speaking, and academically advanced on structured testing across domains. So we discovered that it wasn't a specific math or writing challenge per se, maybe the skills related to math and writing, which we'll talk about. Language, verbal, visual memory, extremely high, inhibitory control, very high, but relative weakness in fine motor control, so especially for handwriting, and a relative weakness in verbal inductive reasoning, which means piecing together verbal information into that cohesive whole. And then very low sustained attention on monotonous tasks. So teachers also reported several executive functioning weaknesses on questionnaires. So, the first day I tested this kiddo, I'm like, wow, he is very bright and very, very compliant, and he listened and he tried really hard and super pleasant and all of these things. But then we really started to dive deeper. What's really going on here? Why are teachers starting to express concerns? So based on the results, we made a lot of recommendations to maximize alertness and attention. So using standing desks, sitting on exercise balls, listening to instrumental or lo-fi music, all of the things that I just mentioned. Attention and organization, copies of class notes, rubrics, textbooks at home and at school, so that it mitigated the challenge of carrying materials back and forth. Nonverbal cues from teachers, so like a tap on the desk or a hand signal to redirect his attention quietly, because he was very, very motivated to do well and very eager to please, but that attention was easily distracted, especially when he was not super interested. So those subtle cues could be helpful and gentle. Visual reminders on his desk, like check your work or am I listening? So that when he looks down at his desk, he sees that. Some self-monitoring maybe could include checklists like after homework, did I complete all the problems? Did I check my work? And then in class every day, maybe was I focused on the lesson? Did I listen to instructions from start to finish? So a couple of goals and have them written for him that he can kind of self-monitor, which increases independence as well and maturity in that respect. Task initiation, so having a get started routine. And then we made some specific writing suggestions and math suggestions based on his particular profile. So I wanted to provide this example because there can be really, really, really bright kids that are struggling in some domain, and it can be like, well, he has all these abilities and skills. Why can't he just work harder? Or why can't she just achieve in this area? She seems great in so many other areas. And an eval can really dive into what is underlying that challenge. Okay, so lastly, just concluding, and then we can do some questions. Services that we provide at PPA, the evaluations I spoke about. So those really early developmental evals from 0 to 3, psychodevelopmental evals from 3 to 5, psychoeducational evals from 5 and up, all the way through adulthood, neuropsychological, also all the way through adulthood. More psychological only is like social emotional personality. We can do those. They're not as common, but we certainly do see them. And then gifted testing. And then consultation we provide with parents, school staff, tutors, people at Score at the Top or Score Academy, providers like psychiatrists, SLPs, so speech and language pathologists, occupational therapists, learning specialists. And then finally, therapy. So Dr. Davidson and I both also do therapy and intervention work. So that can look like individual psychotherapy, groups that we offer at PPA. There are many of them, so lots of options. And then often Dr. Davidson and I and others in our realm do a lot of parent coaching to provide behavioral supports and skills for parents to nurture and guide their child through some of these challenges. Okay, so we hope this is helpful. We hope it empowers you to better understand and identify differences that impact learning behavior, communication, etc. And again, if these differences are identified, children can receive the appropriate interventions and supports to help them meet their potential. I worked with an educator recently who really put this beautifully when she said, identifying the problem doesn't make the problem exist. Right? It may still be there, but giving it a name doesn't make it come into existence. Giving it a name actually can help us understand what that might entail, in addition to really understanding the individual profile that we see and the individual strengths and needs. So thank you guys for listening. I would be happy, both of us would be happy to take questions, Jason, if there are any. So I'm going to stop sharing. And thank you.
It doesn't appear that there are any questions. So
Okay.
thank you guys so much for such a thorough presentation. Really appreciate it. And to everyone on the call, I'm going to send out the doctor's contact information in case anyone wants to get in touch. So have a great night, everyone, and we'll see you next time.